All right, let's dive right into another deep dive. This one, well, it's a case that's got me thinking already. It's the Freeway Phantom.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know, there's something about unsolved mysteries, especially one like this, from 71 to 72 in DC, preying on young black girls. It's heavy stuff.
Absolutely. And the fact that it remains unsolved all these years later just adds to the intrigue,
Yeah.
really makes you question what they knew back then and how they investigated things.
Oh, for sure. And, speaking of intrigue, you, our listener, sent us some really interesting sources on this one. We got a Wikipedia article, a missing person poster, even a clip from a true crime podcast.
Well, that's dedication.
I know, right? It seems you're just as hooked on this mystery as we are.
Well, that's a good one.
It is. It really is. And going through these sources, I mean, it's just impossible not to be struck by those missing person posters. All 6 victims, young black girls.
Yeah.
It's tough to think about.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the times, the 70s. It was a period of huge social change in America. And sadly, these girls' vulnerability really just highlights those societal issues of the era, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And the sources you provided, they do a good job of bringing those complexities to life, especially with the details like the killer's phone calls and that weird note on one of the bodies. Man, it's just creepy.
For sure. It's like he wanted to be known, but not caught.
Exactly. So, before we go any further, let's remember the names of those 6 girls, the ones whose lives were cut short. Carol Denise Spinks,
Darlenia Denise Johnson,
Brenda Faye Crockett,
Nina Moshe Yates,
Brenda Denise Woodard.
and Diane Denise Williams.
It's important, like you said, to see them as people, not just names on a case file.
Hmm.
Their stories are powerful and sad. To get a feel for this case, let's go back to the beginning, the timeline.
Right, back to 71.
Yeah, April 71. 13-year-old Carol Denise Spinks disappears. She was running an errand for her sister, just going to the 7-Eleven, and then poof, gone.
And 6 days later, her body's found near a highway. So sad.
It is. And just a few months later, July 71, Darlenia Denise Johnson, only 16, she vanishes on her way to work.
And her body, they found it just 15 feet from where Carol was found.
15 feet. That can't be a coincidence.
Right. It makes you think maybe the killer knew that area, felt comfortable there, almost like it was his.
Like a hunting ground or something.
Yeah, maybe. It's definitely a strange detail that investigators must look at.
And then that same month, 10-year-old Brenda Faye Crockett disappears too. But this is where things get really strange because she actually calls her family from a phone booth. They think the killer made her do it.
Yeah, those phone calls, they really complicate things. I mean, it shows he wasn't just a killer. He was like a puppet master, too, pulling the strings, getting inside their heads. Think about the mental toll on Brenda, on her family, having to talk to him like that.
It's just awful. It's like he was playing with them, enjoying their pain, right?
It's possible, yeah. He probably thought he was so smart that he could outsmart everyone.
But Brenda's family, they weren't giving up that easily. They were determined to find her.
Absolutely. And those phone calls must have been analyzed like crazy, every word, every inflection, trying to hear something, anything that would lead to him.
Makes sense. They were probably looking for any little detail that could help.
Right, like his voice, his accent, anything that would narrow it down. Back then, things like handwriting analysis were just starting to be used.
So they were really pushing the boundaries of what they could do. Sadly, though, Brenda's body was found the very next day.
Awful.
It is. But sadly, the nightmare wasn't over. In October 71, 12-year-old Nina Moshe Yates is abducted and murdered.
And it's around this time the media starts calling him the Freeway Phantom.
Because they were finding the victims near highways, right?
Exactly. The name just stuck. It's
Yeah.
creepy, but it fits. Makes him sound like a ghost,
Yeah.
just appearing and disappearing at will.
Oh, totally. And the name probably played into the public sphere, too. And then, November 71, Brenda Denise Woodard, she becomes another victim.
And this is the one with that strange note, right?
That's right. In her coat pocket, they find this note. It says, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can. Freeway Phantom."
The capitalization is weird, right? And those misspellings.
It's just unsettling. Do you think he was trying to, hide his handwriting or how smart he was? Or was it something else, was he messed up in the head?
Oh, good question. That's probably what the investigators were trying to figure out. And here's another weird thing. There was a judge at the time who always used that word tantamount in his rulings.
No way.
Yeah, and that little detail, it led them to this guy named Robert Askins. He had a history of violence against women, a long one.
Hold on. So we got a judge with a favorite word, and a guy with a violent past. Sounds like a pretty good lead, doesn't it?
It did. It did. And Askins, he was definitely troubled. I mean, in and out of mental institutions and prison his whole life. But even after searching his place, they couldn't find anything that connected him to the Freeway Phantom murders. Not one piece of physical evidence.
Wow. So he was just a person of interest, not a real suspect?
Right. A dead end, basically.
Yeah.
It's like they were so close, but just couldn't quite get there. Were there any other big leads they followed?
Yeah, there were a few, but nothing concrete. One that stood out, though, was this gang, the Green Vega rapists.
Oh, yeah, them. They were pretty notorious.
Yeah. And they were operating in D.C. right around the same time as the Phantom.
And their thing was abducting women near highways, being violent. It's not impossible to think maybe they escalated, started killing, too.
So maybe it wasn't one killer, maybe it was a group.
Could be. I mean, this Green Vega gang, they were organized, they were brutal.
But connecting them to the Phantom, that was tricky, huh?
Yeah. Their methods were similar in some ways, but not an exact match. So we've got a bunch of leads, some interesting possibilities, but a lot of unanswered questions. It's enough to make your head spin. Definitely. The Freeway Phantom case, it's like a maze with twists and turns everywhere you look. And sadly, more dead ends than anything.
But we're not done yet. We still have Diane Denise Williams to talk about, the last victim. And then there's the big question, why did he stop? And those missing shoes? That's so strange.
You're right, we can't forget those details. And we'll dive into those very topics when we come back for the second part of our deep dive into the mystery of the Freeway Phantom.
All right, we're back and ready to keep digging into this Freeway Phantom case. Man, it's a real head-scratcher, you know? So many twists and turns, it's hard to keep it all straight.
Yeah, it's definitely a case that sticks with you.
It really does. Before we get too lost in all the theories, though, we need to talk about Diane Denise Williams. She was the Phantom's final victim, right?
Right, the last one. And hers is a particularly sad case. Just 17 years old when she vanished. September 72. She was just getting on a bus. And like all the others, they found her body near a highway.
It just goes to show, even doing something ordinary like taking the bus, it wasn't safe back then. It really hits home when you see those missing person posters, you know?
Absolutely. They remind us that these weren't just cases. They were people with lives, with families. And after Diane, it's like the Phantom just disappeared himself. The killings, they just stopped.
Yeah, which is almost scarier, isn't it? I mean, where'd he go? Did he move? Did he die? Or is he still out there somewhere just waiting? It's a creepy thought.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what was going on in his head. What would make him stop so suddenly? Maybe he thought the police were getting close, or maybe something changed in his life. I don't know.
It's all speculation, I guess. While we're trying to figure out why he stopped, maybe we should take a closer look at how he did things, you know? Like, what was his MO, his pattern? Maybe that'll give us some clues.
Oh, good point. One thing that jumps out is where he took his victims. He always grabbed them from public places, like bus stops or busy streets. It takes a certain kind of confidence to do that, a real boldness. And it makes me think he knew the city, knew how people moved around.
So he wasn't hiding in the dark, waiting to pounce. He was out in the open, right there in plain sight. It's almost creepier that way, don't you think? Because it means he could blend in, seem normal, even harmless.
For sure. And then there's how he killed them. Always strangulation. It's very up close and personal, Like, he needed to be in control, to have that power over them.
It's a disturbing thought, isn't it? And speaking of disturbing, there's that one detail we can't forget. The missing shoes. Why take the shoes? Was it just practical? Or was he trying to say something?
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure. I think it could have been both. On the one hand, taking the shoes, it could make it harder to identify the victims or to track them.
Like he was trying to cover his tracks, make it harder for the police to connect the dots. But why leave the bodies near highways then? They'd be found pretty quickly, shoes or no shoes.
Right, exactly. And that's where the symbolic part comes in. Some people think taking the shoes was about dehumanizing the victims, turning them into objects. It's a creepy ritual we see with some serial killers. It's like a way for them to feel powerful, to feel in control.
Wow. That sends shivers down my spine. But it does fit with that whole power thing we were talking about. It's like he wanted to erase who they were, make them anonymous, just another nameless victim.
Right, exactly. And don't forget, back then, forensics wasn't what it is today. So taking the shoes could have been seen as another way to slow down the investigation.
Like he was playing a game with the police, outsmarting them at every turn.
Well, he was definitely succeeding for a while.
Yeah.
And speaking of mind games, we can't forget those phone calls. The ones he made Brenda Crockett make to her family. I mean, that just adds a whole other layer of twisted to this whole thing.
Yeah, it shows a whole other side of him. It wasn't enough to just kill. He had to torture the families, too, make them suffer.
It's a pretty common thing we see, unfortunately. For some people who do this kind of thing, the pain, the terror, that's part of the thrill. It makes them feel powerful.
And he didn't just call to taunt them. He was giving Brenda wrong information, telling her to lie. He was intentionally misleading the investigators, which means he was planning this out, thinking ahead.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just some random act. He was organized, meticulous. I bet he thought he was some kind of criminal mastermind, like he was untouchable.
And for a while, it seemed like he was.
Yeah, sadly. And that's what's so fascinating but also frustrating about this case. He was so good at covering his tracks that all these years later, we still don't know who he was. It's like trying to catch a ghost.
It's a good way to put it. And that's why these kinds of cases are so hard to let go of, I think. They show us that there are still mysteries out there, things we may never fully understand. And that can be a scary thought. It is. It's like we're trying to make sense of the senseless, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Of course not. And we got some good pieces to work with here, The phone calls, the way he operated in that cryptic note. Each one gives us a little glimpse into his mind, even if it doesn't give us all the answers.
Speaking of that note, I think it's time we take a closer look at it. I mean, you sent us a copy, and just reading it, it sends shivers down my spine. Those weird capital letters, the misspellings, it's just all so strange. What do you make of it?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Was he trying to hide his writing? Was he messing with us? Or was it something else entirely? It's hard to say for sure.
It's like he's trying to talk to us, but in a code we can't quite crack. And then there's what he says, this is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. It's like he's admitting he's guilty, that he doesn't care.
It does sound like a confession,
You see
right?
that too?
But then there's that other part. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can.
Yeah.
It's like he's taunting the police, daring them to find him.
It's just so confusing. It's like he wants to be caught, but he also wants to get away with it.
Yeah, and that's what makes this note so interesting and so frustrating. It could be genuine remorse, or it could be a really messed up mind game. We might never know for sure.
It's like he's still playing with us, even from beyond the grave. It's enough to make your head spin.
So where do we go from here?
Well, we've got some more suspects to talk about, including a couple of ex-cops, which is always intriguing.
Oh, yeah. And we still need to tackle the big questions.
Yeah.
What was his motive? And what's the deal with those missing shoes?
Absolutely. And we'll dive into all of that when we come back for the final part of our deep dive into the Freeway Phantom case.
All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the Freeway Phantom case. Man, I gotta say, this one's really got me thinking. All these twists and turns, it's like trying to untangle a huge knot. It's definitely a case that stays with you.
It really does. And as someone who loves a good unsolved mystery, I can't help but get hung up on those unanswered questions. And boy, this case has a lot of them.
It does, it does. Every time you think you're getting close to an answer, you hit another dead end.
Exactly. So let's jump right in and tackle some of those head on. Let's start with those missing shoes. We've talked about a few theories, but what do you think? Any of them stand out to you?
Well, we talked about the practical side. Maybe he took them to make it harder to identify the victims or to mess up the investigation. But I think the symbolic side is pretty compelling too. That whole idea of dehumanizing the victim, showing them he had the power.
Yeah, there was definitely a ritualistic element to his crimes. Like he had a very specific way he wanted things done.
Right. And the shoe thing, that could have been a big part of that ritual. It's just such a strange detail. It really adds to the creepiness of the whole thing.
No doubt about it. But it still doesn't explain why. Why go through all that? What was driving him? What was his motive? That's what I really want to know.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that every investigator, every armchair detective wants an answer to.
Yeah.
The note we talked about, it kind of hints at a hatred of women, but honestly, that could be a smokescreen. Don't forget, this guy was a master manipulator.
That's true. He could have been trying to throw everyone off, create this persona that wasn't really him.
Exactly. So the note, it's a piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't give us the whole picture.
So if it wasn't just hatred, what else could it be? What makes someone do these kinds of things?
Well, with serial killers, the motive is usually a pretty tangled mess. It could be a need for power, a desire to be famous, some kind of messed up sexual thing, or even some twisted idea of love. It can be any one of those things or all of them mixed together.
It's like we have this puzzle and we have some of the pieces, but the most important ones are missing. We can kind of see the image, but we can't get a clear view.
That's a good way to put it. And without those missing pieces, without knowing more about the killer's life, his past, his relationships, it's almost impossible to say for sure what was driving him.
It's so frustrating, isn't it? We have all this evidence, all these clues, and we're still no closer to the truth.
It is frustrating, but it also shows us that the human mind, especially a criminal mind, can be a really dark and complicated place. And sometimes, no matter how hard we try, we just can't understand it.
So we're left with theories and speculation. And that feeling, that feeling that something's not right, that there's something we're missing.
Yeah, and maybe a newfound respect for how far forensic science has come. I mean, imagine if this happened today. With all the technology we have now, who knows, maybe they would have caught him.
That's a good point. But even with all the advancements, there's still that human element. People are unpredictable, and sometimes they do things that just don't make sense. And that's what makes cases like this so fascinating and so disturbing.
They remind us that evil exists, that there are monsters out there, and that sometimes even our best efforts aren't enough to stop them.
They also remind us that we need to look out for each other, that we need to remember the victims. We can't let them be forgotten.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the Freeway Phantom case. We've gone down a dark road, and it's been a wild ride. But unfortunately, there's no satisfying ending here.
No, but hopefully we've shed a little light on this complex case. We've seen the challenges the investigators faced, and we've explored the mystery that continues to intrigue people even today.
We have. And to our listener, thank you so much for sending us these sources. It's been an honor to explore this with you. And who knows, maybe someday someone will uncover a new clue or a new piece of evidence, and this case will finally be solved. But until then, the Freeway Phantom case remains open, a reminder that some secrets just refuse to stay buried. Thanks for listening.